So we covered the easy terms above here. Now it's time to shift gears a little bit and take care of those terms on the bottom. That will be probably a little bit more difficult. However, I would argue that in order to be able to work with Flexbox, in order to understand Flexbox, all of the features and properties that it actually has, your basis will always be a good understanding of those three terms here, main axis, cross axis, and flex direction, because basically all of the other stuff in Flexbox is based on those terms. So in order to actually understand them, my suggestion would be to do a little thought experiment here and have just a couple of thoughts about how are we actually working with UI systems in general. And what I mean by that is that probably we don't notice that like on a day-to-day basis because we are so used to it. But when you work with programs like, I don't know, Photoshop, Paint, some sketching programs, I'm sure every one of you was working on such a thing, but also things like UI Builder, obviously. We do have some kind of implicit assumption about the space that we are working in, right? We are kind of having the assumption that we are working in a 2D space and that everything has its sort of order. And this order is basically defined by two axes in a 2D space, right? And typically we call those axes the vertical axis for top down and the horizontal axis for right and left. And obviously that's a natural thing for us to perceive the world in that kind of sense, because we are not in outer space without any orientation where we don't know what up and down actually is. We have gravity, and for us there is a top down, and then there is a horizontal thing that is just the other thing that is not going top down, basically, right? But now for Flexbox, a good idea is to actually, for a starter, to actually forget about this for a second. And what I mean by that is, now imagine that we lost this orientation for a second. We would not have this natural context in which we understand what is top down and what is kind of the other thing. And so then we could still work on something like a 2D space on, I don't know, a tablet, on a page or something. But we could just say, instead of having this natural naming for the axis vertical and horizontal, what we could still do is say we name kind of one axis as the one axis, and then we do just the perpendicular axis and name this the other axis. And so now this might seem pretty stupid for now, because like why should we do that? But one of the things that is now happening is that those axes are not kind of having any natural distinction, right? They are just exactly the same. We could as well say that this was the one axis and this was the other axis. And in a way, that is what Flexbox is doing. The only difference is that they don't name it one axis and the other axis. What they do is they name it the main axis and the cross axis. There is, however, absolutely no reason why I should choose the vertical axis here as main axis. I could absolutely, in the same way, name them in this way, to say that this was the main axis and this was the cross axis. The only thing that is important is that by those names I can now distinguish them again. But they don't have this, they can be both kind of. The main axis can be the vertical axis, the horizontal axis like here, and it can also be the vertical axis like here. Now, this might still seem a little bit stupid because actually we kind of gave something away. Where we before had at least this orientation with vertical and horizontal, we now gave this orientation away basically and just changed the names. So if this was just the reason, that would be pretty stupid. But obviously there is some thought behind this whole thing. And this starts with the idea that now that we have a main axis and a cross axis, we have certain rules that apply to the main axis and certain rules that apply to the cross axis when we lay out our stuff. And those rules are different. So whenever you have your cross axis in one direction, those rules will follow kind of the same direction. And whenever we change the main axis to the other one, now those rules will apply to the horizontal axis. And that's why they chose this kind of naming convention, such that you can always say, what are my rules, by saying, okay, I know where my main axis is pointing. If you would still use vertical and horizontal, you would always have to say, okay, in the one case, my rules were on the vertical axis, but now I changed it and they are in the horizontal. If you just say, I always call this axis main axis, but it can kind of go into both directions, now I know what my rules are, right? Because they will always be the same on the main axis and the same on the cross axis, but different. So the main axis has its rules and the cross axis has its set of rules. And the main axis, that's why it's called main, because it's sort of a little bit more important, or at least it has some other set of rules that are kind of kind of a little bit more prominent and a little bit more main than the cross axis. And we will see that with examples in a second. So if you're still confused, I think that's still a good sign. Don't worry about that. I don't think if you heard that for the first time that you can really understand that for now, because there is actually one ingredient that is missing, and that is basically who is deciding where the main axis actually is and where the cross axis actually is. And that's where this third property kicks in, or this third term kicks in, which is called flex direction. And it's the flex direction that you can set, and that is then deciding where your main axis and where your cross axis actually is pointing to.